Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Supporting Families. We are excited to be here on this first week of November with a great guest, Eli Lebowitz, who's got a fantastic program. And you may have seen and be familiar with the book. It's called Breaking Free of Child Anxiety and OCD, a scientifically proven program for parents. You may know it as SPACE, which is very simply supporting parenting for anxious childhood emotions. So we're going to get into questions and we'd love to take questions from the chat, and we'll get to those. But very quickly, let me do some short announcements. As you know, this live stream is educational and is not intended to replace therapy. So for treatment-related questions, please work with your provider, or you can contact a local clinician. You can use the IOCDF's online resource directory for help. If you go to iocdf.org/find-help, you can see the website on the screen, and that'll help you locate a trained clinician near you or somebody who might be offering like teletherapy. The International OCD Foundation is not a crisis hotline. So if you are in crisis or you are ever feeling suicidal or unsafe, please call the 988 Suicide Crisis Hotline. You can just dial 988 in the USA from your phone. You can also access it online at www.988lifeline.org. Or you can go to your local hospital emergency room, or in the US, you can also dial 911 if you're in crisis and need support immediately. And we want to create a safe space and be kind and respectful for everyone in the chat. So at the end of the day, we're all here to learn and create community, and this OCD community is fantastic. So help us build that and make it stronger. I note that this is broadcast in several social media platforms, and it is being recorded. You can always see the re-recording online on the IOCDF's YouTube or Facebook page. One last quick announcement. Don't forget the online OCD conference is later this month. You can register. Go to the IOCDF's website. It's November 23rd and 24th. So with that, let's get right into it. Eli, so great to have you here. Every time I'm at an OCD conference or I'm doing the online OCD camp, there's always presentations or questions about space. So it's great to have you here. Let's start with the basics. Like, what inspired you to develop this, kind of as an alternative to the traditional exposure-based treatments?
Okay, well, first of all, thanks for having me on. It's an honor to be here. Hello to everybody who may be listening wherever you are. In terms of where did this come from? Why does this exist? I guess it's kind of the coming together of a few different things that together created the impetus for this. One part of that is the fact that what is often called internalizing disorders, whether that's anxiety, whether that's OCD, whether that's depression, these are disorders in which parent-based treatments were vastly underdeveloped relative to other problem areas, like the more so-called externalizing problems, behavior problems, attention problems, things like that. If you have a child with a behavior issue where they don't do what they're told, or maybe they're aggressive, maybe they hit people, things like that, it is almost taken for granted that therapy will involve parents. And so much of the evidence-based treatments for those problems work through parents. Now, partly that reflects the fact that children with externalizing problems are sometimes difficult patients. And so there's some motivation there to be able to work with parents. But, many years ago, I'm talking like decades ago, I worked in an anxiety and OCD clinic, and I would screen new families to try to see, are they going to be a good fit for the clinic? And what we did in the clinic was cognitive behavioral therapy or exposure and response prevention, right, like CBT, ERP. And we had a long wait list. And so part of my job was try to figure out who should we put on the wait list and who's really not going to be a good fit for this treatment. And you know what? I ended up boiling that down to one question. And that question was, does your child want help? And when the child was motivated and wanted help, I'd say like, okay, you go on the wait list. And if the child didn't, if the parent said, well, no, they don't really think they need help, or they're not really willing to talk to anybody, but I see them and I see the problems and I want to get them help, then I'd say, well, CBT really is not going to work for your kid. We probably shouldn't, put you on the list. But it just really became frustrating to not have good answers for those families where the child maybe didn't want help. Now, today, we don't think of space as a treatment specifically for children who don't want to do other therapies. Any child who has OCD or anxiety or, actually increasingly some other related conditions could potentially benefit from space, but it really started out in part by trying to find something to offer parents of kids who may not be really great candidates for their own therapy. And that's one of the, I can go on, but I want to leave you time to say something too. So that's one of the threads, I guess, that really led to developing this treatment.
And it's so important. I think often, any parent out there understands that when you have a child with OCD, you really need to learn as well. I mean, I always say education is like the first thing you have to do. You need to understand OCD. You need to understand how it's treated. You understand different forms, how it might manifest, what a compulsion and obsession might be. So there's a lot of things that parents just need to dive into. So having this resource and teaching them, and like you said, there are a lot of kids who just aren't ready. So this gives it kind of a parent a way to kind of help themselves and break free of some of the accommodations. If you have a question and you're watching us live now, please just reach out to the comment button or the chat button and leave a comment. We'd love to address it. Let's get a little more into supporting parenting for anxious childhood emotions, or SPACE, as it's a family-based treatment for childhood and adolescent anxiety disorders. So not just OCD, but other anxiety disorders. I know there are 5 core principles of SPACE, and I don't know, you don't have to go into crazy detail about them now, but reducing, I guess my question is, of the 5 tenets, is that also part of what you start and like kind of build up to? So that one of the first principles is reducing parental accommodation. Then you have increasing parental support. Psychoeducation is 3rd. 4th is gradual exposure, and 5 is parental self-care. I'm curious, is that like the steps, or it's like we just, those are the 5 and we
I actually would say, I'm going to jump in, give my own version of the principles of, I'll give my version of the principles of SPACE, because actually, I think it really just boils down to the first 2 things you said, to increasing support and to decreasing accommodation. Exposure, you mentioned exposure. Of course, exposure is an effective part of, it's an effective treatment for OCD and for anxiety. It's actually, I wouldn't say it's a core part of SPACE, however. I think I would just say those first 2 things are really what this treatment is about. Increasing support and decreasing accommodation. But when we talk about support in SPACE, I think support is a word that like 20 different people are just going to hear 20 different ways, right? And you could say, well, I am supportive of my child, but maybe not in the way that we mean, right? Like you might be a very supportive person, but it's not necessarily in the way that SPACE means support. And so I just want to give my definition for like, what is support when we're doing SPACE? I would say you are being supportive in response to your child's distress or symptoms or anxiety, like whatever it is that's causing them this distress. You're being supportive when you're showing your child 2 really key messages. And one of those is a message of acceptance, like, I get it. It's real. You really do feel this way. I'm not belittling it. I'm not dismissing it. So I'm validating, I'm acknowledging, I'm validating and accepting your distress. But then I'm combining that with message number 2, which is a message of confidence in the child's ability to actually tolerate some distress. You put those 2 things together, that's when I would say that's a supportive statement. And so in SPACE, we put a lot of emphasis on helping parents to really adopt this supportive language, which could sound like saying to your kid, oh, I get it. This is really, really hard for you, or your OCD makes you have this really awful thought, and that feels terrible. And I know that you can handle that feeling, right? So you're giving that supportive message. And then the other really big emphasis in space is the reduction in accommodation.
That I think is one of the, I mean, two, I think the reducing accommodation, we also get tons of questions on that in the conferences, and we always get it here on our live events. So super important skill for parents to learn. Um, Speaking of reducing accommodations, um, how in general does reducing family accommodation like help break the cycle of OCD, or help kind of a parent um, help their child?
Well, let me put it this way. The irony of the fact that internalizing problems were less addressed with parents, there's actually something really ironic about that, and it connects to your question of why reducing accommodation is actually helpful. But there's something really ironic about that. And what's ironic about it is that actually internalizing problems, especially fear related problems, are maybe the best possible target for parent intervention. Why? Because children naturally tend to look to their parents when they feel scared, right? Like it's built, it's hardwired into us. It's built into us. When I'm scared, when I'm worried, when I'm threatened, when I'm stressed, what do? I look to my parents. By the way, that's true of all mammalian creatures, not just human beings. It's true of all mammals. When you're young and you feel threatened, you look to your parents, which means that actually fear-related problems are really a really prime target for parent intervention. But what happens is that parents tend to start noticing those cues, noticing that my child is scared, and then I accommodate that, meaning I'm starting to do things differently because of your symptoms, right? Like, so if it's OCD, I'm spending time listening to that confession, or I'm doing your rituals with you. I'm buying the extra soap. I'm not sitting on your special designated seat in the living room because that one is like decontaminated, etc. I'm never mentioning the taboo word. I'm, etc., etc., etc. And what happens is that that accommodation tends to ultimately perpetuate the problem. So it helps the child to feel better in that moment, right? Like, I want you to do this ritual with me, and you do, and I feel a little bit better. But just like we know at the individual level, right? If you just think about the child themselves, what do we tell patients? We say, if you do your ritual, do the compulsion, you're going to feel better in the moment, but your OCD is going to get stronger, right? Your OCD is going to get even bigger, and it's going to last even more. We have to break that cycle. Well, the parent's accommodation tends to do a similar thing, right? It's like me doing your ritual for you, in a sense. And that also will perpetuate the OCD. That also tends to maintain the OCD. And so drawing back on that accommodation gives you an opportunity to see that actually the OCD can be defied, right? Like, it is possible not to play by OCD's rules. And it tells you your parent is so sure that you're going to be okay that they're willing to actually just say, no, I'm not going to do that anymore. And they get it. You might be upset. You might be mad at them. You might be really angry. But they're so confident that you're going to be okay that they're actually willing to defy that OCD rule that everybody's living by. And that starts to give you a little bit of confidence as well. So gradually, not overnight, not all at once, but gradually, systematically pulling back on those accommodations really clears the way for the child to start believing that it's possible not to give in to OCD all the time, to actually live differently, which is kind of the key thing in starting to overcome this problem.
I love how I never thought of it that way about like delivering confidence. I mean, I remember from our own experience, my daughter with OCD, um, when it was really bad in our life, I used to think my natural instinct as a parent was to help protect, solve, or like somebody's in distress, the same way if she got, a cut on her hand, let's get rid of that, or she got a cold, I want to treat it. So I can solve the problem for them. And therefore you just get into a spiral where you're not able to solve it. But I guess I never thought when we were doing the exposure therapy and my wife and I were also pulling back on some of our accommodations that there was an angle of confidence in it, whether it was, um, kind of helping her with some rewards that she might get, or showing her how far she's come and talking it to in a positive way. So it's what as long as I've been around the OCD community, it's wild to think that like it was building confidence, and I loved how you framed that. Um,
Yeah,
the
I think that was really what you said is so spot on, because like, of course we want to rescue, right? Like, of course you want to rescue. You see your child, they're in distress. Of course you want to jump in there and rescue them. But I think it's important to remember that always having somebody to rescue you, that's a beautiful thing. But you know what? Always needing to be rescued by somebody else is actually a really vulnerable way to live. It's a very vulnerable and very limiting way to live. And the alternative of maybe doing with a little bit less rescuing from somebody else, but actually knowing that you don't need it, that you can actually be okay, is worth working through some of those difficult moments that can occur when you start pulling back on those accommodations.
Yeah, we learned very quickly, like, oh, we have to like parent in a very different way. We need to like retrain how our parenting style. And because again, it took a while for us to be like, this is a problem that our daughter has to learn how to solve, and our daughter she has to be able to recognize, understand, and then figure out how to have the tools to, overcome something that might be bothering her, rather than us swooping in and helping for her. So um, how does a parent or a caregiver get started? Let's say let's throw a scenario out where somebody might realize they've been accommodating for a long time, or they might be kind of part and parcel in the OCD world, that it might have like really sucked them in, and they're as part of it as their child is. So how would you recommend somebody get started with your program, or the step one and step two of beginning to unravel those accommodations and put that confidence?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you said at the beginning, this conversation is not a replacement for actual therapy, and that was a good caveat that you had at the beginning. But in terms of what does the process look like, say you're working with a therapist, or even if you're doing it on your own, the book that you showed at the beginning is really like a step-by-step guide. You can kind of work through the program even on your own. The first thing we really want to do is actually practice those supportive statements, even before you do anything else. Before you start reducing the accommodations, I would say spend like a couple of weeks just responding with supportive statements to your child when you see that they're in distress. You're still accommodating. You're not changing everything, but you're starting to trickle that message that says, "I see it, I get it, and I know you can handle it." And let that just be your focus, because that's a change from the way most parents actually have been communicating. It sounds obvious to say you should be accepting and you should have confidence. Actually, neither one of those two things is all that common in how we, and I'm including myself in this, I'm a parent too, and I'm including myself in this. Neither part of that supportive recipe is all that common in how parents actually are responding to their child when they're in distress. We tend to fall into other traps. Right?
OCD is distressing for a parent to watch.
It is.
And it's hard to step back and be like, I'm going to give an affirmative statement. I'm going to show that confidence. I'm going to practice that here, when clearly somebody that you love is having a hard time and you want to help them.
Exactly. You tend to start falling into traps. Maybe you become a little more protective because you are doing that rescuing. Another trap, by the way, that you can also fall into is being a little overly demanding where you don't really have the acceptance. And that can happen too. Even in the same parent, it can happen. One day you're more like protective, but then you run out of energy and there's no more gas left in the tank. And suddenly it's like, enough is enough, because this has been 3 hours now and I'm done. And suddenly you switch gears and you become a little bit more demanding about it. Like, enough, you got to get with it, get a grip, suck it up. Nobody else is talking like this. Nobody else is doing these things. Why are you the only one? And so, those are traps. And so we want to like clear the air a little bit. So spending a couple of weeks just focused on those supportive messages. And then the next thing that we would typically be doing is just identifying what are all the ways in which you have been accommodating. Like, think over your day, think about your morning, think about meal times, think about bedtime, think about play dates, think about homework. Go over your entire day and try to notice what are some of the ways in which your child's OCD where anxiety is impacting your behavior. Are there things you're doing extra? Have you excused them from a lot of other chores and responsibilities? Are there things you're not doing? And this is not confession, right? You're not confessing crimes and you're not confessing sins. There's no shame in the fact, that if you accommodate your child's OCD, that means you're like 98.5% of parents who do accommodate their children's OCD. So welcome to literally the club of humanity.
Yes, you are part of a giant club.
You're part of a giant club. Plus, it just means you care, right? Like, it just means you notice, right? Like, you're sensitive. It's not bad, but we want to identify those. Like, what are all those ways, so that then you can do the next thing, which is to just pick one thing that you're going to start changing. And even pick one accommodation, something that's totally under your control. Like, this is a really deep thing about space, is that there's never in space a demand of the child to change anything about their own behavior. It's wild, right? Like, think about that. You can't say that about pretty much any other treatment, right? Like, you think about what is behavior therapy? It's like, well, you got to change your behavior. But I actually make a really simple promise to parents in my first session with them. I will usually say to them, at no point in this whole treatment am I going to ask you to make your kid do anything at all, or to stop doing anything at all. That's not how space works. It's not about making your kid do things, because let's face it, making your children do things is easier said than done, right? Like,
especially depending on their age,
depending on their age,
older, the more independent and strong-willed can be.
Exactly, and also depending on their anxiety level, right? Like, because if you're going to go home and you're going to say you have to do something that's going to go against your anxious feeling, there's a good chance they're going to say no, thank you. Right?
Yeah.
Right. Like, they may. Now, look, if you're a therapist and you do exposure with patients, when they say no, you don't yell at them, right? I don't know a lot of therapists who start yelling at their patients for not doing exposures. But if you're a parent and you think, I have to make you do this thing, and you say no, actually there is risk that you start getting into a fight about it, that you start getting into conflict. And so in space, we never want to put parents in that position. So it's really all just about the things that you can control yourself. Maybe I do go around the house with you and check the locks 3 times every night before we go to sleep. Well, I can choose that I'm not going to do that anymore, but I'm not saying to you, the child, I'm not saying you have to stop. In fact, you probably won't stop right away, but I'm showing you that I think it can be okay. And so I'm not doing it anymore. So you pick one accommodation and you make a really clear plan for how you're going to change it. And then you do another really important thing, which is to tell the child about that plan. Don't take them by surprise.
And you're describing, in some ways, what I remember our therapist talking to us with our daughter. It was like, okay, talk with her. Let's make a list before you do anything. Make a list of things that are bothering her. Let's talk about, and like, you confer. So in a lot of ways, like, the parent is doing a similar type of homework. It's just for themselves. It's just with like a self-realization of what you might be doing, and it might take a couple of days. But I love even the idea of sitting with it or taking time to identify what these issues are, it does kind of parallel to what your child might be doing in therapy.
Hmm.
But a lot of the things that you're saying about like the parent control, it does feel like, and I don't know if you've heard this, like that I, as a parent, will be modeling some behaviors that your child can understand. And I'm curious if you find that maybe that might help a kid who might be a little more resistant to therapy, or just maybe help them, give them courage. Like, and maybe there's confidence that a child can build when they see their parent doing something
Yeah,
hard.
I think you're right. What we see very often is that the kids for whom it's really hard, when you do start pulling back on those accommodations, sometimes there is anger at first at the parent because, like, why aren't you doing it? That's the way that I will feel comfortable right now. And you're refusing to do it. And that can make you angry. But when parents stick with it, that anger is quickly replaced by hope because you start to realize as a child, like, you know what, my parent really believes that I can handle this thing. That is, I think, the most important message for an anxious child to really internalize is the idea that I can be anxious and still be okay. Because what really drives impairment in all of the anxiety disorders, right? Whether it's OCD or whether it's any other anxiety driven problem, separation anxiety, social anxiety, generalized anxiety, all of them, what really drives the most impairment, the way it's going to mess up your life, is your unwillingness to experience anxiety. Your determination not to be anxious because you think if I'm going to feel that way, it's a catastrophe. I can't handle that. It's terrible. I'll never feel better. It's so awful. And so I have to do everything I can not to be anxious. And that leads to a ton of impairment, to a lot of disturbance in my life because if I have to take all these precautions to make sure I'm not anxious, well, I can't do this, I can't do that, I have to do this, I can't do the other thing. And so it really drives a lot of impairment. When you start really systematically with the whole, like withdrawing those accommodations and you're doing it in a loving way, in a caring way, you're starting to show that child an image of themselves as somebody who actually can handle being anxious. And that's where that hope comes from, I think, the confidence and the hope. And we see really significant change. Clinical trials, multiple clinical trials of space show that doing that treatment is as effective as doing therapy directly with a child. Even if the child is not in their own therapy, if you're just doing that work with the parents, you actually get very comparable outcomes as doing therapy with a child. Now, maybe the best thing would be to do both, right? Or do the work with the parents, do the work with the child. That sounds like the best thing. But it's still kind of remarkable that even without the direct child therapy, you can get really good results just by doing this work as a parent. I think it's a really empowering message for parents.
Yeah, and so necessary for a parent to feel like they have confidence in the same way you're building confidence with your child, that you're building confidence in yourself that I can do this. I might be have been stuck in this world of OCD or part of the rituals, and now I can figure out a way to unravel and get some of my control back, or figuring out a better way to help myself or my family. I just want to thank you for some of the comments that we're getting. Yes, MJ, the patience and consistency certainly is a key, and I think that can be very hard for people to understand. I think one of the important things that Ellie pointed out was like it takes time, and I think a lot of your natural instinct is like we got to fix this right now, and it's got to take a month, or it's how long is this going to take? And
Mm-hmm.
the real answer is it can take a long time, and sometimes like just practicing or talking out what you're going to do is part of that time, and that could be frustrating, but patience and consistency is key. You're also never going to be all perfect all the time, so don't expect to be perfect every single time. It's just like everything, it takes a lot of practice. Connect for OCD has said space has been life changing for our family, so thank you, Ellie, for creating the book. That's really
Well,
helped a
thank
lot of
you.
parents. And I think the question was answered, Jessica, in the comments, but I'll just kind of show you what it looks like breaking free from breaking free of child anxiety and OCD, and you can see it. I know it's available. I was able to purchase it on Amazon. I'm sure it's available in lots of bookstores. Um, and wow, the comments are starting to blow up now, which is great. Um, so you were talking, we've gone a little bit over, being reducing the parental accommodations, kind of making your list, testing some acceptance and validation statements, and trying to build that confidence. So let's say a parent has made kind of that list and starts to look at and picks one thing. What's their next step?
Their next step is to think about that one accommodation that you're focused on, right? Something that happens pretty frequently. You don't want to pick something rare, right? Like you want to pick something that's happening frequently, maybe every day even, or at least a few times a week. And within that thing, you're going to make a decision around, okay, do I want to just stop that completely? Or maybe I just want to reduce it gradually, right? Like if I've been answering 30 questions that your OCD thoughts are like driving every single day, maybe I just want to say, look, I'm going to answer up to 5 questions a day, or something like that. So you could do a more gradual step. You don't have to do it all overnight. This speaks, by the way, to what you were just touching on in terms of the patience, the persistence, and the patience. Those are really the keys in space, as I think in other treatments also. Like persistence and perseverance and stick with it is really key to success. And I would say when it comes to treating anxiety, a lot of times the slow road is actually the fast road. Meaning you think you have to rush and it ends up taking longer because suddenly you realize, oh, I made a mistake. Now I'm backpedaling. Now, you take it one step at a time. Sometimes it ends up being a shorter process than what you thought because you make much better progress. So you're going to make a really clear plan about that specific accommodation, and then you're going to let your child know exactly what you plan to do differently and why. Right? You're going to look. I don't think it's a secret that anxiety and surprises don't actually make the best cocktail. The more anxious you are, the least you probably relish being surprised in even in positive ways, by the way. Really anxious children often don't respond well even to like positive surprises that you throw them a birthday party by surprise. They may not thank you because you like to feel in control of stuff. And so what we usually do is write them a letter, which you'll read to them, and you just explain briefly, this is what I see. This is what I understand about my behavior. You're not making any accusations of them. You're not saying you've been doing it wrong. You're basically saying, look, I get it. This is really hard for you, but I don't think that this thing that I've been doing is helping you. In fact, actually, I think it may be not helping you. It may actually be making things worse. And that's why I'm going to change it. And I know that it can be hard, and I'm sure you can handle it. And I love you. We'll often say this is not a punishment, right? I don't want a child thinking I'm not accommodating because I'm mad at you, because I'm punishing you. So you could just say it explicitly. In that book that you were showing, there's like a bunch of examples of like these kinds of letters that you can that you can write. And you'll tell it to your child, and then you just start doing that, and you just follow through on that. And, maybe that first time is really hard, second time is really hard, but it does get easier because your child realizes, you know what, I did get through it. I worked with a mom who would do this ritual every night for her child. And the first time that she decided not to do it, there was such a big blow up around it. Her child was really mad and really anxious.
Oh, yeah.
And there was a huge blow up around it. Really, really big. And mom actually had to leave the house. Like she just felt like, okay, I can't even be here. And it was like this horrible night. But I'll say 2 things. One is the next day, this mom said to her child, what she said? She didn't say, oh, you behaved badly or that's not okay. She said, I'm really proud of you. And her daughter was confused. Why are you proud of me? I drove you out of the house last night. She said, you got through a night without your ritual. That's a huge deal.
You got a big win. Yeah.
That's a huge win, right? Like, yeah, that was such a hard thing to go through. And I saw how hard it was for you, but that's a huge win. But the other thing is, that was the first night, but the second night was easier. And the third night was easier. And pretty soon that ritual was a thing of the past, right? Like, we don't do that anymore.
I was, I was going to ask a question kind of about, I would frame it as like OCD getting angry at space, angry that parents are doing this. But I want to get to a couple questions in the chat, because there's kind of an idea of like, well, what age group is this appropriate for? Could this work with a teenager, or have you seen success with teenagers as well as young adults? So do you have like, oh, this is more for parents of younger kids, or hey, this can work for all ages, and maybe there's ways to adapt it depending on the age of the kid?
Right. So we actually have data, even both from our clinical experience and many other people's clinical experience, but also from clinical studies from kids from a really young age, like 3 years old, 4 years old. And all those are not necessarily OCD specifically. It might be OCD, but it could also just be like separation anxiety, the problems that are even more common in those really young ages. And going all the way up through adolescence, I think it's possible that there are fewer 17, 18-year-olds for whom this is the optimal treatment than there are like 9-year-olds and 12-year-olds and 6-year-olds for whom it is the optimal treatment. There might be fewer in the 17, 18-year range, but there are many for whom it really is a good fit. Even at that older adolescent age, there actually are many for whom it is a really good fit, because there's still a lot of accommodation happening. And actually, I think if you have a 17-year-old and space does feel like a good fit for you, then you probably really need it. Because if you are accommodating a lot and your child is already of that age, it's really hard to break those patterns at that point. It's even harder than with a younger child. And so you probably really do need a program like this to be able to succeed. You mentioned young adults. We do, yes, we've worked even with parents of children who are no longer technically children, but are, especially if you're living at home and things like that. We do work with parents of kids who are in college, and there's a lot of accommodation happening there too. There might be texting back and forth all the time, and things like that. And then this is like going a little bit outside the OCD box now, but we actually have a version of space that we developed specifically for parents of adult children, but adult children who are not really functioning independently as adults.
Right.
What sometimes is called failure to launch, or various other names and nicknames for it, but really meaning you are an adult, but you're not really functioning independently as an adult. So you're not really working or in college or school or whatever. You're just kind of stuck in life. This is a very common problem, and it's one without a lot of clinical answers. And so we actually developed a version of space. There's a few versions of space or adaptations of space that we've developed for other problem areas, and that's one of them.
Okay, so very quickly on a follow-up on that, is there a book about that a parent or a young adult could look into? Like, how would they access the specific
not yet.
Okay, it's coming.
Well, I'd say, yeah, it is, I guess, but there's 2 other books that are coming first. But there's there is, however, a book. If people do want to read about that, there's a book not from me, but still very relevant, called Non-Emerging Adulthood, and I would take a look at that if you are a parent. It's not quite a like step-by-step guide for addressing it, but it's a very relevant resource for parents of adult children who are in that situation.
Great, and it's good to know that there's more coming on this over the next couple of years, like building the repertoire. So a couple questions that we're getting in the chat related to space and working with maybe a kid that might be on the spectrum or like comorbid issues. How would a parent adjust, or how would the space be able to help a parent?
Yeah, it's a really excellent question. Actually, just this year, we actually published a clinical trial of space specifically for children with autism. So we're treating the anxiety, right? We're trying to address the anxiety, but in children on the autism spectrum or with autism spectrum disorder. These were high functioning autistic children. And so they were of average intelligence or above. They were verbal children. We don't really have as much experience with very deep impairment, like really delayed intelligence and nonverbal children. But for those more higher functioning children on the autism spectrum, we have very good outcomes. I would say I really would advise a parent to consult with a therapist around it, because I think it can get tricky, and ideally you want to be working with somebody who has good experience in anxiety and also good experience in autism. Now, it's not always easy to find your ideal therapist, right? Like, we can draw the portrait of my ideal therapist. That doesn't always mean that they're available to you.
Hard to find, yeah.
Right? But ideally, that's what we would be looking for. One of the tricky parts of doing space for a child with autism is figuring out what is accommodating the anxiety versus what is potentially accommodating some of the more core autism symptoms, like the repetitive restrictive behaviors and interests, because those also can be compulsions, right? If your child has RRBs, repetitive restrictive behaviors, or interests, those can take the form of compulsive rules and rigidities that are very similar, actually, to OCD symptoms. And so sometimes I would say, do your best to try to identify what really feels like it's accommodating anxiety. But even if you're not sure about that, then ask yourself, is this thing that I'm accommodating, is it adaptive or maladaptive, right? Like, is it helping the child to actually function better, or is it potentially getting in the way of their functioning well? And to the extent that you're reducing an accommodation of something that is more maladaptive, that is more problematic for the child's functioning, I think you're on pretty safe ground. But I would recommend reading the article that we published. I could try to share a link to it but I can't multitask, so I'm not able to see
No,
that.
that's cool. I actually, if you we might be able to dig it up.
Okay, that would be great.
Behind camera, yeah. What's
that's
it?
perfect.
What was it called? Or
actually, give me 1 second, and I will tell you.
okay.
It was called not that.
If you're just joining us or you're tuning in on one of the replays, we're talking with Eli Lebowitz, and we're talking about a fantastic program that he developed for parents called SPACE, which stands for Supporting Parenting for Anxious Childhood Emotions. Sorry, the name of the article?
The name of the article, I don't know if I can like screen share or something, but I'll tell you, the name of the article is A Pilot Trial of Space in Autism. So pretty straightforward. Like most of my titles, pretty straightforward.
We'll see if we can get that and pop a link in the chat. So anybody that knows me knows that I'm going to ask this question. So is there a role that a sibling or a loved one can play as well in the SPACE program?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question, in part because actually siblings also tend to do a lot of accommodating of child's OCD, anxiety, etc. And that accommodation, sometimes it's, I would say sometimes it's willing, sometimes a little bit less willing, meaning there's also times when it's a little bit imposed on the sibling. Also sometimes witting and sometimes unwitting, because we have like sometimes little siblings who are accommodating without even realizing it, right? Like they just think, oh, this is what my sibling wants or something like that. And they don't even, or even they get fun out of it because their sibling's paying attention to them, and like maybe it's even rewarding for them. And so I think reducing the role that they'll play in SPACE would depend a little bit on the age and maturity of the sibling, and maybe a little bit on the relationship between the siblings, because I don't want to tell a child who happens to be the sibling of an anxious child, right? Like, I don't want to tell them, you're not allowed to accommodate. My rule is I'm not trying to control the child's behavior, and that goes for all the kids. And so just like I'm not saying to the anxious child, you have to stop your ritual, I'm not saying to the sibling, you are not allowed to accommodate. But I would want to explain to them that they don't have to. And if they're a little bit older, a little bit more mature, I would explain why that might not actually be helpful. And if the sibling is even older and is willing, sometimes we can rope them into the treatment a little bit, have them be what we call a supporter for the treatment. One of the principles of how we implement space is actually helping parents to create a little bit more network of support for themselves in going through the treatment. We very actively encourage parents to get help from the people in their lives who can facilitate the process, who can support them, sometimes emotionally, sometimes more logistically and technically. And a sibling can be a really wonderful supporter for the process. So I like the question because it fits very much with the mindset of how we're approaching the process in space.
Yeah, it's and also kind of helping everybody get involved and feel that sense of that help and accomplishment and be able to
Yeah.
like help build a family unit.
Right.
So are there things that you would say to a parent or a caregiver, some watch outs or mistakes, pitfalls that you sometimes see, having developed this program and having taught and are actively teaching other families about it, anything that you have found that like you words of wisdom you provide parents to some things they, to look out for or pitfalls, mistakes?
I think some of the common pitfalls that I observe are, and we've even touched on this a little bit in this conversation. For example, trying to take shortcuts in the process, I think is a pitfall. And sometimes it'll work out. Sometimes you'll take a shortcut and it actually will work out, but also sometimes it won't. And you could have avoided that by being more methodical. So what do I mean by taking shortcuts? Like you jump straight to reducing accommodation, but actually remember, I said don't start by reducing accommodation. I said take a few weeks to actually just work on being supportive. And sometimes, maybe that feels like it's not active enough. It's not meaty enough. I want to be getting in there and making these big changes. And so I skip it. But for the child, that change in your behavior is going to land very differently if it came after a week or two of them hearing you tell them those supportive statements. It's going to change the ground on which the thing is falling. And so, I would say don't skip that. Don't skip mapping out the accommodations and just say, oh, I know what accommodation I should reduce. I'll do that. No, take the time to actually work through it more systematically. The other advice I would give is be persistent, persevere. Don't look for quick wins, right? Like maybe the first time you do it, it doesn't go that well. That's okay. That's okay. Just try again the next day. I'll tell you something. I think that if you can imagine, like you're following families, like you're making a movie or something, you're following families as they do space. I'm saying this hypothetically, right? But like if you did that, I think if we stopped the movie after the first time or second time that parents reduce their accommodation, for a lot of families, it would look like anybody watching that movie would say, well, it's obvious they made a terrible mistake.
Yeah, it failed. Yeah,
It
it didn't go
failed.
well. Right.
It
It didn't go well.
not just it failed, but it backfired, right? Like
Yeah.
it's worse even. It not only did it not help, it literally made stuff worse. And I think actually a reasonable percentage would, not everyone, right? Like some of them would look amazing, but there would be a lot where it would be like, yeah, this is a total bust. What a terrible plan this is. But you know what? Let that movie run another time, another time. Suddenly it's like 4 times you've done it, 5 times you've done it. Like you start repeating and another week passes and suddenly that movie looks a whole lot better.
Yep.
And so be persistent, right? Don't look for that quick win, but like have some tolerance for the fact that it might even get a little worse before it gets better, but you're going to get through it and it's going to be worth it.
Yeah, and you might be surprised sometimes you'll something might be working and suddenly for one night it didn't and you don't know why. And that may not be a cause to go, okay, we have to reset or redo something different. It's just OCD, just the way sometimes OCD works, or your mood or your child's mood. And but yeah, you're right about the persistence and the patience. It does pay off. So earlier we were talking about, okay, you made your list, you pick one thing, you start one thing, it's working. Um, have you found that things um, parents can try multiple things at once, or as they become more successful, or is it like, hey, stick with one, build that one, make sure that thing is working before you move on to the next, and then the next, and then the next?
I would say, I think if I had to give advice that, like, that it would be good for everybody, my common denominator would probably be do one thing at a time. Things don't have to be perfect before you move on, but they have to be reasonably good. In other words, you have to be able to follow your plan like most of the time, and without it being like a huge explosion or a big dramatic moment. When it starts to feel like this is the new normal, I would say, okay, we can do one more thing. Let's add one more thing. Sure, there will be families, there will be parents there where you could do two things and it would be fine. But again, you're probably better off just defaulting to, let's just do one thing at a time. And remember, everything you're doing, your child has to cope with. And if you said you're better off you're better off doing it like one thing at a time than trying to do a lot and then backpedaling, right? And so, yeah, probably be methodical, take it one step at a time, you'll get there. Because even though lots of kids will have like a lot of different accommodations that parents are doing, you don't need to work through all of them. You will see once you've done one accommodation, you've reduced, and then another one, maybe three you'll start to see that effect of that is so much broader, right? Like here's a metaphor. Let's say you have weak muscles. Well, let's say your leg muscles are really weak or something, right? Like that's going to affect your behavior and your performance on a lot of things, right? It's going to affect your ability to hike and to run and to jump rope and to climb stairs and like all of those things. But you just need to strengthen the muscle, right? Like you don't need to strengthen it separately for rope jumping and hiking and stair climbing and running.
Right, yeah.
Just make the muscle stronger. So pick one thing. You want to jump rope? Great, jump rope. But once you've done that, hiking is going to be a whole lot easier for you, right? And so is the other thing. And this is similar. So doing one thing at a time is okay, because it's not like you have to work through an endless list of accommodations.
The program, I've seen a lot of therapists talk about it. How are you also actively teaching and running trainings for therapists on how to use this program? Is there like, I don't know, go so far as your certificate, but hey, like how are you making sure that more of the community is understanding, and maybe the trained clinicians and therapists, can also help parents with this practice?
Yeah, absolutely. I put a lot of energy into dissemination of the treatment, into training other therapists. We have training workshops. This is for therapists, I mean, now, not for the parent of the child, just to be clear so people aren't confused. But they're usually 2 days, 2 very full and very busy days of learning. And that's assuming that you already do have prior knowledge about OCD or anxiety. Like you're not starting complete beginner, but you're learning space now. And so, and a lot of them are online. A lot of workshops are online. What people can do, if you're a therapist, you think you might be interested in learning more, go to the SPACE website. It is spacetreatment.net. And you can, there's a tab there for like training for therapists, and put your email in the little form and I will let you know when a training is scheduled. They do tend to fill up pretty quickly, but we're always working on scheduling more training workshops. And by the way, if you are a parent and you're looking for a therapist who has done the training, you can also go on the same website, spacetreatment.net, and click on space providers, and you'll find a list, and you can search it by your state, your zip code even. I mean, assuming there is somebody in your zip code, but you can search it by your state or your country. There's at least one space provider in every state.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. Well, I've trained more than 3,000 people over the past few years. So that's a lot of providers, and hopefully you can find somebody in your area that is doing space.
That's amazing. 3,000 individuals learning space. No wonder I've seen a lot of therapists talk about it, and it's so popular. I wonder if we could get the spacetreatment.net on screen. That would be great to as we kind of wrap up here.
Are you saying that to me or no?
No, I was
no. Okay.
folks behind the scene.
Okay.
But my last question is really, okay, so we mentioned the site spacetreatment.net. Where else can people find resources? You know, you have videos on social media? Like how
There's
can
a
people
Facebook
learn more?
page. Let me see if I can. I want to put like a link to the it's facebook.com/space treatments. Note the plural.
Okay.
But so if you follow that page, I will generally post there. For example, I could post a link to this, right, to this conversation because it's recorded. I could post a link if you send it to the and put it on that Facebook. There you go. Thank you. I can put things like that there. There are many like podcasts. There's the books, like the book that you mentioned, Breaking Free of Child Anxiety, is a good resource. You can find some things on YouTube, and so I think if on the website there's actually a resources tab, and you can find a lot of resources through there as well. You won't find me personally on any social media, but Space is out there.
That's great. I mean, you're getting the word out, and I think it's also, I mean, just understanding that your time is so well spent as well teaching other clinicians, because the more, as you started this program saying that you identified that there was a kind of a gap in this teaching of parents, and understanding that the parents really wanted success. So that's where this whole thing was created, then treating and understanding that, hey, I can't be the only one who has this knowledge, or hold it to myself. I gotta spread the word and help others teach it themselves. You've just compounded the amount of people who can, and the amount of families that can get help by this. So thank you so much for joining us today, Eli. Really appreciate it. And folks, you can see a replay of this, and this will be on the IOCDF's Facebook and YouTube page. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Some just quick wrap-up notes. Don't forget the online OCD conference is in about a week and a half, November 23rd and 24th, 2024. You can register on the IOCDF's website. It's a virtual conference, so you can attend from anywhere. And you can also see the list of speakers and what's going to be happening on those 2 days. Reminder that the IOCDF is donor supported and a nonprofit organization. So if you really appreciated tonight's live stream, or if you've watched others, there's a full slate of work and live streams that the IOCDF puts on. It's donor supported, so we'd appreciate any amount of funding or charity that you could share. There's a link on the IOCDF's website, iocdf.org/donate. Anything is super appreciated. And coming up right after this, in about a minute or so, is our Young Adult Special Interest Group. There's going to be a live talk on Instagram. So I believe that might have already started on the IOCDF's Instagram page, and tonight's topic is OCD and depression. So you just go to Instagram, and I think it's at IOCDF is the page, and you can check out the young adult conversation right now. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I hope you have a great rest of the year, Eli, and thank you so much for creating this program. We're going to be back for supporting families. Our last one of the year will be in December, where we're actually going to be talking with the Young Adult Special Interest Group. So that'll be a really more of a round-robin Q&A session. So look forward to seeing you in December on that. And in the meantime, have a great evening, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much.